So, when we talk to schools about becoming cooperative schools, I always take people back to Robert Owen, who I believe is the really critical link between schools and cooperatives. Robert Owen is regarded as the father of the cooperative movement because the early cooperators used many of his ideas to build their model of cooperation. But he was also the father of primary education in the UK. He was the first person to say publicly children should not be working in the factories and the mills. They should be at school learning, they should be playing, they should be enjoying their childhood. And at his community in New Lanark in Scotland, he set up a school, a primary school, and it was very different from other schools in the country at that time in the way that students were taught, the children were taught. Robert Owen believed that children should learn through doing things that they enjoyed doing, and that they should learn about art and beauty and nature. And this old painting shows the school, shows a dance lesson happening, illustrations of animals from around the world on the walls, a very different environment from the way that most schools looked at that time. And just the final point on Robert Owen, the thing that I think is really interesting and ties into what Linda was talking about earlier on, his school was called the Institute for the Formation of Character. So we come back to the idea of cooperative education being about forming the cooperative character. Fast forward to 2003. So we've just skipped more than almost 2 centuries. And look at the UK, and most of Robert Owen's ideas about cooperatives would not be found in any school in England. The idea of cooperatives was completely absent from the school curriculum, except perhaps in history. Maybe you might find a mention of cooperatives, the Rochdale Pioneers, when you were learning history. So a number of people in the movement, the Cooperative College, some colleagues from the cooperative group, wanted to do something about this problem. You know, where are cooperatives? How do young people find out about cooperatives if they are never mentioned at school? And there was a government initiative at the time to encourage schools to adopt a specialism. And the specialism might be arts, it might be mathematics, it might be technology. It didn't mean that that is the only thing the school would teach, but they would teach a bit more of that thing than of other things. And quite a lot of schools chose business and enterprise as their specialism. So we worked with 10 schools that became specialist business and enterprise colleges in different parts of England, and the cooperative group put in some funding to support them. And with those schools we developed teaching resources about cooperatives, and those schools shared, the teachers from those schools were involved in developing those resources, and they were shared between the schools and made more widely available through the internet to anybody else who wanted to use them. That network was the start of what has become a very significant movement of cooperative schools now, those 10 schools. And it wasn't just because they saw value in teaching about cooperatives. it was because they began to find that cooperatives didn't just stay in the business and enterprise curriculum, but they began to leak out into other areas of the school curriculum. And the idea of the cooperative values as a way of running an organisation, as a values base for an organisation, began to take off within the school. So the school began to put emphasis on self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equity, equality and solidarity in the way that the school was run. For some of the schools, they already believed in some of those things, but having the cooperative values very clearly spelt out gave them a real focus, and so it made a huge difference. Made a difference to the engagement of the students, made a difference to behaviour in the school, and very importantly, in most of the schools it made a big difference to the attainment of the students. They became more engaged, they were more keen to learn, they had better relationships with the teachers, and so they got better exam results. And this seemed to us to be very significant. So this was great for 10 schools, but there are 22,000 schools in England. So, what about the other 21,990? How do we scale this up? This was one problem that we faced. The other problem that we faced was, what happens if one of these schools, the head teacher retires and somebody new comes in and they have different ideas and they change everything? It would be completely wasted, and there would be nothing we could do to stop that happening. This coincided with a round of reforms of the education system in England. And reforming our education system is a regular pastime of British governments. Every government reforms the education system at least 2 or 3 times. It's a massive problem for us, actually, because it's very, very demotivating for schools and for teachers who are constantly having to change the way they do things, and are never left alone to get on and provide good education. But the Labour government that we had at the time in 2006 introduced a new idea, a new way of organising schools, which would hopefully improve standards, because we're very obsessed with standards in this country, exam results basically, and comparing schools for what results, who gets the best results. And so they introduced this model called trust schools, where you would have external organisations as partners in running the school. So maybe a business, a university, perhaps a local healthcare trust, maybe for something aspirational, maybe a local soccer club or something like that. But you would bring in these partners who could help to raise standards in the school. And we saw this as an opportunity to perhaps build on this model something that could actually be more cooperative and have a cooperative governance structure. And so through negotiations with the Department for Education, they allowed us to put together model rules for a cooperative trust school. It still has the external partners, but as you'll see a bit later on, it also has a membership base where the stakeholders in the school have a say in the running of the trust that controls the school. Since then, there have been more reforms and different governments, and we now have a school system in England which is highly fragmented, has many different forms of schools, in the state sector, publicly funded schools, but working in different ways, with different rules that apply to them, and the general direction of travel is a real marketisation. It's towards the privatisation of the full privatisation of our education system, and that's something which many people are very, very concerned about, because if you're putting public money into running schools and you're giving that public money to private companies who are going to pay shareholders a dividend out of their profits, the only way they can make profits is by spending less on the education that they're providing. So this seems morally wrong to many people in this country. So one of the issues that cooperative schools wanted to address was, how do we avoid a situation where money can be taken out of the public sector economy and put into private hands. So the idea of a cooperative school seemed to be possibly one way of avoiding that. At the same time, the local authorities who had previously been responsible for supervising, looking after schools and supporting schools in their local area, have had massive cuts in their budgets and have had powers taken away from them and centralised in the Department for Education. So now they are not able to provide anything like as much support to schools as they did in the past. Equally, there are financial pressures on the schools, and school budgets are being cut back as well. So schools in England over the last 10 years have faced huge changes and have had to really, any school has really had to think hard about how it will be able to continue to meet the needs of its local community and meet the needs of its students, and what is the best form that it can adopt to be able to do that. So the work that's been done over the last 10 years on the idea of cooperative schools has been in that context. And I think this ties in again to what Linda was talking about earlier on, because in many ways the development of cooperative schools has been a pragmatic approach. It's been trying to find an answer to the problem of how we safeguard good quality education for our communities. Yeah. In parallel to that, though, this is a quote from a head teacher about why his school became a cooperative school, but you can read that one on the slides, so I'll skip over that one. And as I said, we've developed the model for trust schools, but also as various other options, academies, free schools that have come onto the landscape in the last few years. We've tried to provide cooperative options for each of these models. It's very complex. I don't think you need to even begin to try and think about the governance models of these schools, because it doesn't apply to Korea. It's something very uniquely British. It will probably change again next year. In fact, I think it's highly likely that it will change again, whether for the better or the even worse, I don't know yet. So we've developed a number of models for cooperative schools. Okay. I think I showed you this slide in the introduction last week. This shows a little bit of the geographical spread. These are only in England, not in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, because responsibility for education is devolved to the regional assemblies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So the reforms, and they have stuck with local authority control of their schools. They haven't made all these changes to the system that we have in England. But as a result of the development of the cooperative model and schools finding out about it and deciding to adopt it, we've now got over 700 cooperative schools around England. Some of them are clustered. I think I mentioned last week the ones down in the southwest, a lot of very small rural schools. This model, again, it's the pragmatic solution to a problem. The cooperative model works particularly well for them because by working together in clusters, they can safeguard their future where the financial pressures are making it very difficult for them to continue to survive because they don't have the economies of scale of larger schools. But by working together, they can gain those economies of scale. With schools, I think there are exactly the same tensions that Linda referred to when talking about cooperative education more generally, between the pragmatic reasons for becoming a cooperative school and the ideological reasons for it. And the bits I've talked about up to now have been some of the pragmatic issues which have driven schools to adopt this model. But there are also a lot of people working in schools who really believe that cooperative values and developing the cooperative spirit, the cooperative character, is something very worthwhile, and want to focus their schools on the idea that cooperative values can drive an education which will produce good citizens, rounded individuals, not just people with the highest exam results, but people who can really contribute to their communities. Young people who have a commitment to those values and exhibit behaviours, that reflect their cooperative identity. So when people ask us what a cooperative school is, we say there are a number of different elements to it. First of all, it would have a cooperative governance structure. But just a governance structure alone doesn't necessarily make it a cooperative school. It also needs to teach about the idea of cooperatives in its curriculum, and it needs to consider its cooperation in its pedagogy. And that's been one of the areas where there's been a lot of development, still a lot more development to do, but one area where real participatory methodologies are starting to be found in not just maybe one classroom in a school where the teacher is particularly enthusiastic, but across the whole school, where students are becoming co-constructors of their curriculum. They're working with the teachers. In some places, some of the really good cooperative schools, students for much of the time have full control of their classrooms. You might walk into a classroom and you wouldn't realise there was a teacher there. Teachers have become facilitators, not sages, not people with all the knowledge. So that's one of the things I think is really, really exciting. But it's not universal yet. The other aspects that we think are really important is that cooperative values drive staff development. And again, it comes back to the importance of education. Schools where teachers think they don't have anything new to learn, I think, are probably very poor schools. And to be fair, the vast majority of teachers in this country are very committed to continuing professional development. Making sure that they have control over that professional development, that they have a real voice in it, is an important aspect of a cooperative school. And the final bit that we think is really important is the way that school engages with its community and the way it meets the needs of its community and is responsive, and the way the community is engaged with the school. If we want the young people to become active citizens, then they can't spend their first 18 years in isolation in a box and then you throw them out into the world and expect them to know how to function in it and how to contribute to it. So that constant interaction with the local community is really important.
So what it means is within one school's, let's say, year 6 curriculum, how much proportion will we talking about cooperation or cooperative?
Okay, not necessarily a huge amount. You can't talk, you can't talk about cooperatives all the time, and that's why I think the pedagogy is really important. Actually, learning cooperatively, you can learn the skills, but there are quite a lot of opportunities when you start to look for them. So, for example, when you're teaching geography, and one subject which might be taught in geography is about fair trade, and that's an opportunity for you to talk about the role of cooperatives when you're teaching about fair trade. When you're teaching history, there are lots of examples. There's also some interesting ways of, for example, teaching maths, which probably they're not talking about cooperatives, but you could use, wherever you have a business example, it can be a cooperative business example that you use. And it doesn't have, it's just a case of making young people aware that cooperatives are an alternative. But the main way that they learn about the cooperative is by being a member of one, and that's their school cooperative. And so, as a member in their multi-stakeholder cooperatives, so they have different constituencies for different different categories of stakeholders. So students have a constituency of membership, and they organise themselves. They might have a student membership forum that feeds into the main members forum. They will elect representatives to that main members forum, and they will take on a whole variety. They will use their membership of the cooperative to take on responsibility for a whole variety of activities in the school. One other really good example, there's a school in Plymouth, which I personally regard as one of our best cooperative schools. All their extracurricular activities are organised as student cooperatives. So, for example, and everybody in the school has to be involved in at least one of these. So they have, for example, a big band, a brass band, and it's run by the students as a cooperative, and it's a very good band. They play very well, and so they get paid to go and do gigs in the city through the year for events, and the students earn some money is earned from that. The students decide what to do with that, so they might buy instruments for new instruments. They might pay for music lessons for some of the students who can't afford the music lessons, and so on. And that's how they do it. Each of the clubs that they have in the school is run like that. So I think that is really how, the most important way of them learning about what it means to be a cooperative. And I think, we are optimistic that a lot of young people will graduate from these schools, and when they think about how to organise a business or how to organise an organisation, the example that they're most familiar with will be a cooperative. How are we doing? Right. So the key characteristics of a cooperative school, it has an ethos based on the globally shared values, and that will be written into its constitution. It's not optional. It's not something you can just do on Tuesdays. It's got to be there, and you can be, held to account by your members for that. Democratic engagement of key stakeholders. So you'll have different stakeholder constituencies, parents and carers, staff, students, the local community, and some of the more recent ones have included a category for alumni, because they found that students who've been at the school want to stay engaged with it because of its cooperative nature. So they've given them their own membership category. The cooperative trusts are a way of safeguarding community assets, because the land and assets of the school are transferred to a charitable trust which is controlled by the cooperative. So in the long term, that makes those schools safer for their communities. So that's going back to the pragmatic point, and that has been an important motivation for a lot of the schools. There's a wide range of models, as I said, to fit with the different types of schools that are existing. And increasingly we're beginning to build links with other cooperative schools in other parts of the world. In Spain there are 600 cooperative schools. They're rather different from ours because they're actually known as teacher worker cooperatives. But they share the values, and so we're trying to build relationships there. There's a growing movement of cooperative schools in Argentina, and it seems like every month we find out about cooperative schools somewhere else that we didn't know about. So we're learning a lot there. These are just a couple of quick pictures showing how a couple of schools actually make the cooperative values very transparent, very clear, very obvious. By they point them out, continually point them out to the young people and remind them of them. This school main atrium and dining hall have them painted up round the balcony, and the one on the right is the code of conduct for the students in one of the schools, and it shows how they link the cooperative values there. Slide pretty quickly. This just shows you the governance model of a cooperative trust school. The important bit is the membership at the bottom. And really it should be inverted because the membership are at the top, really. It's fairly complicated because you have the external partners, you still have the school governing bodies, and you have an intermediary members forum which actually appoints some of the trustees. But I don't think that's necessarily particularly important or of interest to you. The important bit is about actually having a school where the governance is controlled by the stakeholders, and if you can find a way of creating a model like that, then that would be a cooperative school. To support the curriculum, going back to your point, we've developed a range of teaching materials, teaching resources, and worked with an awarding body, an accreditation body in the UK called ASDAN. So there are some accredited awards in cooperative studies, which some of the schools have taken up, and so some students come out with an award or a certificate in cooperative studies as part of their education. We run a website called school.coop, where we encourage schools to share any useful resources that they've developed, and we contribute anything that we develop here and make those freely available. Again, that's something you can have a look at in your own time, and you will get a flavour of the sorts of things that are available to support the cooperative curriculum. A lot of this has come from work in the United States and globally, in fact, around the concept of cooperative learning. And many of the cooperative learning practitioners, not from the cooperative movement, but from education, work around this idea of PIES, the 4 principles of cooperative learning: positive interdependence, individual accountability, equal participation, and social simultaneous interaction. What that's about is that everybody in the group has to make a contribution, but equally needs to value other people's contribution. Everybody is accountable and expected to make their contribution. Everybody has an equal right to participate, and their learning is structured in a way that they get the opportunity to do that, and that interaction between people is really central to it. And on this slide, this is where one of the schools we work with has linked those 4 principles to the cooperative values. So they see solidarity and social responsibility represented in the idea of positive interdependence. They see self-help and self-responsibility in the idea of individual accountability. So they've done a lot of work around linking these educational ideas about cooperative learning to the values of the cooperative movement. I have to skip that really quickly. I could talk a lot longer about it. Some nice pictures of some young people engaged in their communities and some communities engaged in their schools. I think they say quite a lot by themselves without me adding anything. I've already talked about international links. The cooperative identity mark is something which we have developed here at the college to help schools measure and reflect on the extent to which they are embedding cooperative values. It's a quality assurance system. It's very cooperative in its nature. It's done by self-assessment and peer review. It's not a top-down, inspectors come in and decide whether you're good enough. It's about you deciding how you're developing and using that for development planning. And there are different levels that you can achieve and hopefully move up through. Finally, the cooperative schools across the country now have their own secondary cooperative, which is a network called the Schools Cooperative Society, which has been set up by the schools to provide services to cooperative schools. For example, joint procurement. So they might buy energy or buy stationery as a group, and that provides benefits to them. And also to have a voice in policy debates about education, because our group of schools is now the 3rd largest group of schools in England, after the 2 main churches who also run schools. So we are a significant force if we work together. And yeah, I think that was my last slide, and we've definitely run out of time.